Welcome, dear fellow students from Germany, Europe, and all across the world. And welcome, dear guests, whether you're watching live during the second day of the European Union Week 2021 or the recording of this event. In the name of the TUM Speaker Series, the TUM School of Management, HEC Débat, and HEC Paris, I would like to welcome you to the session with Peter Körte, Chief Strategy Officer and Chief Technology Officer of Siemens. Over the next hour, you will hear a keynote by Peter on technology with purpose and why it turns out to be a strategic priority for Siemens. Afterwards, we will have a discussion and also answer questions from the audience. So now for a quick introduction of Peter. He has been Chief Strategy Officer at Siemens since February of last year and Chief Technology Officer since October of last year. And at Siemens, he is responsible for the development of corporate strategy and digitization, as well as the establishment of the Industrial Internet of Things, the IIoT. Peter started at Siemens in 2007 in corporate strategy and moved to Siemens healthcare business in 2011. And most recently, he headed the digital health unit for the development of AI-based diagnostics in medicine. Before joining Siemens, he worked for Boston Consulting Group as well. And some interesting facts for all students watching right now. Peter has a joint master's degree in mechanical engineering and business administration from Karlsruhe Institute of Technology. And additionally, he earned a PhD in strategy and international management from WHU Otto Beisam School of Management. And now before handing over to Peter, I want to encourage you to post your questions in the chat on the right side of the screen or below the video if you are on a mobile device. And there is also the option to give a thumbs up to questions that have already been posted by your peers. And these questions will then be answered in the Q&A part later on. So now, dear viewers, please welcome Peter Körte, Chief Strategy Officer and Chief Technology Officer of Siemens. Peter, stage is yours.
Thank you, Felix, and bonjour tout le monde, and herzlich willkommen. Thank you for joining and thank you for having me in the first place. This is a great opportunity for me also to share with you what we are doing at Siemens and how we look at the world over the next hour. I'm really looking forward in particular on the live interaction with you on the chat. And what Felix mentioned, I did study, unfortunately, neither at HEC nor at TU München, but what I can offer is I studied in Karlsruhe, which is right in between, as it turns out, and it's at the French-German border. So hence, that's something I think important. And what you also should mention that Felix didn't talk about is I spent my first year between university and BCG at Airbus in Toulouse. So I had the privilege of working in a truly Franco-German or English and Spanish company, but truly pretty much driven by Germany and France. And so I'm more than happy also to share a little bit on that experience, because I think it's very important of where we're trending. Now, before going into this, I have the privilege next 15 minutes to talk very briefly about where we think we are going and where the world is going to go and what we will do about this as Siemens. And let me share the screen with you. Hold a sec. And you should hopefully see my screen. Can somebody tell me that you can see the screen yet?
Yes, it works fine.
Very good. Okay, good. So what I would love to talk about is technology with purpose. And the with purpose obviously is super important. Siemens as a technology company, of course, loves technology, but the key question always is, what is it good for? And as always, when we look around us, right now, we tend to think about 5 different things that are happening as we speak. And if you think about the next decade of what's to expect, there's at least 3, if not 5 topics that we all will be hit by. The first being, of course, climate change, or some people would call it decarbonization. I think everybody's talking about it, and this is even becoming bigger and bigger. It's not just the environment anymore, it's also the social aspects, the governance aspects, so what we call ESG. So the world is clearly changing and in need for good technology to address that mega trend of our decarbonization. The second one, quite frankly, in the past, we've been looking at globalization, and around 2010, we've seen actually the very peak of globalization. And it's very interesting with regards to trade, with regards to foreign direct investments. Was at the height of globalization. Ever since, though, the past 10 years, and in particular the last few years, has seen an acceleration in localization, meaning that actually more and more nations become more nationalistic and looking at their own good as opposed to really opening up. And that's a topic that I think also for today's discussion is highly relevant. Now, the digitalization piece, I don't think I need to talk about a lot because everybody's talking about it. And then the other two key points are demographic change, still a very big topic, in particular with the social challenges that's coming from, in particular, the aging societies. And then lastly is the question about urbanization. Now, urbanization is not so much a topic for Europe, to be honest, because we are quite urbanized. It's still the topic and subject of what's happening in developing countries, because it turns out that cities still prove to be the most efficient way of providing infrastructure. But by and large, these are the key trends that we're looking at. Now, you may say, what does this mean for us as Siemens? And it means a lot, because if you look at the change that's happening around us, there's quite a few geopolitical tensions, in particular now between China and the United States. And it begs the question of what is the answer from us as, for one, Siemens as a global company, but for two, also for Europe, and how will Europe actually prevail in this dichotomy? We see the environmental pollution, the natural disasters, the COVID, of course, new normal, new mobile workings, and of recent, of course, the question about resilience of supply chains when it comes down to, in particular, the future trending technologies such as microchips, but also batteries and other materials that are needed for that. Quite a change that is happening around us. Now, there's one big thing that we in Siemens are looking at also with particular interest and curiosity, and that is actually the Internet of Things. Because if you think about it, the first internet, let's call it the Internet of People, is actually a little bit saturating in a way. Because for one, the number of people that are on social media is about to stagnate, because we expect about a total of 4.5 billion. That's half of the world's population almost then by 2025 to be on social media. So while that's good, but it's also very fairly consolidated market in a way. If you look at the United States, with of course Amazon, Facebook, Google, and then there are Chinese equivalents of Baidu, Alibaba, and Tencent. It's a very consolidated view. Now, go on the right side and think about what is not there as of yet, and maybe not as visible, and that's clearly the Internet of Things. And to me, it's the question of connected machines. And if you think about it, there's hardly a limit to this, because there's so many machines today out there in the world that still need to be connected. There's a lot of new machines that are coming that's already connectable from the very get-go. It's a very, very fragmented market. And it's the question of also we as Siemens, but also we as Europe, can we capitalize on that trend and truly set the pace of how machine-to-machine interaction actually will evolve over in the future. So if you look at Siemens, you may have seen that we have been on our own transformation journey in a way. And one of the key reasons for that is speed. Speed and focus, because we all know that this world is changing ever faster. And we need very quickly, we need answers to the changing environments that we have, which is the reason why we said the Siemens Healthineers, being very dedicated to healthcare systems, they're best if they can focus on their particular customer group on their own and take their own decisions. And you may have seen that we've taken one of the largest acquisitions ever by acquiring the world leader in cancer care, Varian, which was a 16 billion acquisition. And Siemens Healthineers would not have been able to do that if they hadn't been on their own. The same happens on the Siemens Energy side, which we actually put more to independency last year through a spin-off. And Siemens Energy itself goes through a massive, massive transition. away from carbons over to renewables. And of course, not just the way we produce energy, but also the way we actually distribute and manage energy and the flow of energy, which in itself is a major transition. Now, I get very often nowadays the question about, so then what is that, this Siemens that you're looking at going into the future? And if you think about it, Siemens at the very end creates the technology that transform the everyday. And you may say, well, what does this mean exactly? And if you do a double click there, we think about it as we have to first and foremost look at the customer and see about how we can help to shape and solve their problem, what they have, which is the reason why we tend to think about technology with purpose, meaning that there's a true value. And there's a clear distinction between invention, which is a great idea and which you potentially can also patent it. But an invention is useless unless it's truly being taken up and it's put to use, which then actually a successful invention turns into an innovation. To do all that, you have to empower your people. You have to let go. You have to trust them. And you have to be fast, because that's what I spoke about it. In organizations as big as Siemens with 300,000 employees, you can imagine if there's somebody who has a great idea, if you want to get all through the ladders and levels of an organization and try to get approval for something, this can take days, weeks, or even months. In a world where speed is of the essence, that's not good enough. And then lastly, we need to have this growth mindset where for sure today, there will be nobody of all of us in the future working the same job that let's say in the next 5 to 10 years, because everything is changing so quickly. In the medical field that I had the pleasure of working in, we were tended to say that medical knowledge was doubling every 20 years in the 1950s. In the meanwhile, it's every half a year. So nobody, truly nobody, can stay up and have all that knowledge available. But the one thing that we know for sure is that we have to continuously improve and that we have to continuously rethink and learn of how we do things. So what does this mean then for Siemens? For us as Siemens, there's the key thing that we firmly believe in combining the real and the digital worlds. So what does that mean? It means that we are not just going for what so many do is just the digital side, and we are also not going just for the real side, in other words, the hardware. What we truly believe is in actually the combination of bringing these two worlds together, because on the real world, you get precious insights in how assets are being operated. And then on the digital side, you have the freedom and the speed in order to optimize the real world. So you may say, well, what does that mean? And let me give you a few examples for what we're doing. For example, with Grundfos, which is a pump manufacturer, we have a strategic partnership where we bring IoT technologies to them in order to connect their pumps, their motors, also in very critical situations. So by that, we actually get 300 million people connected to safe water, and we can significantly improve the way we deliver that clean water for the millions of people that are out there. In the past, you could argue, well, there was a pump somewhere and you did not know its condition, you did not know the throughput. In the meanwhile, you have very accurate readings of where is water required or where it is not required, and where actually these pumps are not operating properly. The next being something which is really near and dear to my heart, and that's going to the kind of ideas around the digital twin. So with Finland, we built actually the Finnish grid operator, we built a digital twin of their power grid. And what that meant is that in order to simulate at the time, it was very difficult. It would take many, many months in order to do that. It was highly manual, and therefore the amount of time you could change the model was very, very rarely. Now imagine a world like today's where constantly you have changes to the grid because you have new renewables coming in, you have new consumption coming in through EV charging, you have the whole discussion about microgrids coming in, so truly changing your environment. simply FinGrid could not do that anymore. Now, the solution was to fully digitalize their assets with regards to transformation and distribution, and thereby being 100 times more granular than actually the very traditional approach that has been taken. And the only reason that this was possible is because we understood of how substations worked, how transmission worked, and at the other hand, that we were able to actually really virtualize that and put this into the digital context, collect the data, and then put this back to use again. The same holds true for BioNTech, and I don't think I have to talk a lot about BioNTech nowadays. I think everybody knows and understands that. What the key difference here is, and what I find truly inspiring, is this notion of batch size of 1. If you think about it today, why are we actually producing in batches? And it has to do with actually changeover times, but it also has to do with a lot of, let's say, fixed process steps that you have to take, such as, for example, documentation. And as you can imagine, in biopharma, one of the biggest and most important topics is proper documentation with regards to the formulation that goes into it, and then also have good proof on the good manufacturing practices, the GMPs, that are so absolutely critical to have a safe and efficacy for the kind of drugs that you're developing. Now, by completely removing any kind of paper-based processes, we truly took out that part in order to speed up, and you've seen what was possible in order to do that in a very, very short amount of time. And then lastly, very, very inspiring to me is one of our customers where we've done that. And this is really, I'm not sure of who has ever seen a little bit of the railway industry, but if you go back to the old relays that have been used in order to actually manipulate a switch in a network, in a railway network, these used to be 4-bit relays that each of them weighing 20 to 30 kilograms, very heavy, a lot of copper, a lot of stuff that would go into it, very prone to failure though, and very little feedback out of that. Now, the railway operators in Norway, they said, well, can't we do this better? Can't we transform the 11,000 signals, the 330 interlockings, the many different data centers, and the lot of cables that we have today, and truly digitize that? And that's what we did with them. So today, as you can see, we significantly reduced actually to 0 the kind of signals, because once you're in the digital world, you don't need that anymore. We only have one interlocking, one data center, and the amount of cables that is required is very little. Now, that's just the beginning, to be honest, because what this does now is, because you have it in the virtual world, connecting this now also to the trains that are being operated on those railway networks, you can change those schedules, the railway schedules, almost within a day. And I'm not sure who knows about how long it will take for example, the German Bahn, in order to do that, the Deutsche Bahn. It takes them many, many months just to do one calculation of their schedule and then operate to this. So again, it's all about speed and helping our customers combining the physical world, actually creating a replica in the digital world, optimizing it, and then putting it back to use. We truly believe in that very unique and different value proposition. Now, there's one more thing nowadays that, of course, I'm sure you all are talking about it. And that's the question about, actually, is it a dichotomy between sustainability and profitable business? And I think we all would believe is that this is actually coming closely together as we speak. We see that there's a lot of pressure from all kinds of sides, that in particular investors are being asked for the people that they invest on behalf of them, that they are supposed to invest into sustainable companies that actually are really focusing on the environment. And I can tell you, for example, at the Siemens side, more than a quarter of our investors tend to be what we call ESG investors. So investors truly that want to see this. Now, it's not just the investors who want to like to see that, it's our customers that say, can you tell us about the CO2 footprint of the products that you're delivering to us? Or it states that actually, like in France, the loi de vigilance, that where you have actually specific requirements of what you need to bring to governments in order to make this work. So it's coming from all kinds of sides, and you may also remember all the conversations about what kind of business we want to be in, because in particular, if you think about gas turbines and coal business and everything, it's a very complicated conversation, as you can mean. But one thing is for sure, sustainability is not just something for where we say we can do good for as a good corporate citizen. It truly has emerged to become a business in and itself, where companies come to us and say, hey, Siemens, can you help us to become carbon neutral by 2030? And you've seen the example also with Grundfos, where that's precisely the topic. Now, last few things around technology. Siemens is very proud, actually, that we are investing so heavily into R&D. And R&D, we would say, is our lifeblood. And you see a few figures on here, which I always find very, very inspiring. I mean, anybody who had ever filed a patent application, and that's quite a big deal, actually. And so to have 2,700 of them every year is truly showing the innovation speed, or at least the invention speed that we have there. We have a global network of universities where I believe is highly critical in order to really collaborate and think about what is research, truly thinking about the very early stages, and then at the pre-development and development things of how to make a business out of it is very important. And of course, TU Munich is one of them, of the 8 that you see up there, that we really enjoy working very, very closely with. And then, as you think about it, what are the key areas that we're looking at today that are truly important to us? And this is something that we have called what we call the corporate core technologies. So technologies that are true for all of us. And I will not go through all of them, but I think most of them you will instantaneously recognize and understand with regards to autonomous robotics, AI, of course, with regards to cybersecurity, simulation and digital twins, what I talked about earlier, but also very interesting things such as connected e-mobility, where we provide charging infrastructure for enabling the EV transition. Then also the question about additive manufacturing, which I also is a topic that I love a lot, with regards to 3D printing and truly making this batch size of one a reality. And it's all happening. It's all just coming from what we know from the consumer space, this instant gratification. We want to see the same thing in the B2B environment. And if you look at it from that angle, all the technologies that you see on here is precisely supporting that trend of acceleration. Now, 2 more things, and actually taking now a look at not just Siemens, but overall the world that we live in. In order to make all this work, of course, you can digitize and then digitalize each company within itself. Now, we all know that the minute you have digitized all your assets, this data is pretty fluent and you can connect it as you wish. The biggest issue, though, becomes the human side that really breaking down data silos is more often than not because of technology, but because of us as individuals, because we don't want to share, or we have actually hesitations in order to do so. So the big question, of course, is always of how can we bring data together in very effective ecosystems to create these solutions, not within companies. And let me tell you, companies always have fears, and departments always have ideas about what not to share, in particular also then between companies and even countries. So the question really is, how can we improve that in order to make this work? And there's an important distinction for me, because we tend to think when we talk about data, we talk about, of course, personal, or GDPR certainly has become a little bit of a standard worldwide, which I think as Europeans we can be proud of. Now, on the other side though, when I talk about data, I'm talking about machine data, which is very different to personalized data. And I believe certainly that this information must flow much, much more freely, in particular if you think about the power of connecting entire supply chains from the very beginning of, let's say, the raw material to the very end, all the way to the consumer. And everybody who's studying, and in case of, let's say, if your major is supply chain and this whole idea of bullwhip effect, I truly believe that these data ecosystems can bring down these bullwhip effects and really drive to flow flow, unprecedented flow between different entities that we haven't seen in the past. And then lastly, is the question of how do we do this within Europe? And there, quite frankly, I've seen very good examples, but I've also seen quite challenging examples. For example, that right now I see a little bit more nationalism happening where French with the Digital Republic, or the Germans also with Cadbury and everything that's happening, where everybody is doing a little bit of their own. And if there's one thing that I would appeal to all of you is, if we fight this fight on ourselves, just in our very little kingdoms, we will not win. Because I had the privilege and honor to stay outside of the of Europe for, let's say, the past 10 years. And if you look from the outside to Europe, what you will see is, yes, it's a very large geography, and it's a very powerful geography if you count together the GDP and if you count the number of people that live in there. But yes, when you look at it also, what you see is a lot of fragmentation. You see poor leadership. You see that there's nothing in terms of a common way and approach of how to do these things. And I can tell you that the countries such as China and United States, they're moving at lightning speed. And very often we actually look at them and we're too slow. And lastly on that, if you look at where the GDP is being created, in particular the next 5 and then the next 20 years, unfortunately, we in Europe fall behind. So if there's one thing that I would like to give you as a takeaway from this conversation is, I firmly believe doing it just your own and fighting this fight on your own will not prevail. We have to come together, and which is the reason why I truly enjoy that opportunity to talk actually to you at HSC, and but also at TUM Munich, and truly build these connections between of us, because we have to break down these nationalistic views and really think in terms of how we make that technology for one real, and then also how to bring it out into the world. And with that, thanks a lot, and over to you, Felix.
Thank you very much, Peter. So now that you've set the stage for our discussion, first of all, I'd like to ask you to unshare your screen again, if you could.
Sure.
Then the view bigger again. Thank you. So first of all, I'd like to remind everybody in the live stream to ask your questions to Peter in the chat on the right side. And now we'll go into our discussion. So on your last slide, you mentioned the co-creation across borders. And of course, naturally, this plays right into one of Europe's goal, which is to maintain open borders. But as we know from the European experience, it's sometimes difficult to negotiate these concrete actions and also find a common goal. So what's your way of co-creating? Do you have any success factors that you can share with us?
Yeah, no, thank you, Felix. I think very often we approach it from the idea of for the purpose of collaboration, yeah, where we say something like what I just said. Okay, we need to come together and we need to do this. I believe you need to have a common goal and value. It needs to benefit you. If there's a true benefit for you, then this makes sense. Let me give you an example. And that might be interesting also for the colleagues at HEC. Yeah? We, of course, as Siemens, are really good at a lot of technologies, for example, with, let's say, automation, or when it comes down to also public security and so on. Now, on the other hand, we are lacking a lot of capabilities, such as, let's say, IT integration and so on. So there was this very large tender, it's the Société de Grand Paris, with regards to the metro lines, which we could not have won if we had done it ourselves. Yeah, but was a very major order. But on the other hand, there was Atos on the other side as a French company who had very good access to this. So Atos could not have won it because they didn't have the access all to actually with regards to surveillance and everything that comes with its public security. So the two of us, instead of fighting each other and trying to win on the account of the other, we truly collaborated, took a joint bid, and actually won the tender. And these are the things that are important to me. When I say have a common goal, have a common objective, how does success look like? And this then becomes sustainable because then you actually enjoy the benefits of that. And then that creates additional opportunities, that creates trust, that it creates intimacy between each other, because teams have to work together. And if these success stories really turn out into a lot of fun, then actually it will create another success story, and in that direction you are already in the midst of a transformation of the way you collaborate.
Mm-hmm. All right, thank you for this. And now, having talked about the corporate perspective of co-creation, so what about the political dimension? For example, the EU Commission published the proposal for the Artificial Intelligence Act a few weeks ago, and this would propose bans on AI with unacceptable risks and also strict obligations on high-risk AI systems. So in your opinion, will these regulations help create technology with purpose, or would they rather inhibit growth in the European Union?
I'd say both. and here's the thing. I obviously what I mentioned also, which is the reason why I mentioned GDPR, is we're good at regulation, and I welcome regulation because it set clear boundaries, and also it can actually enable trust. Because in particular, when we talk about AI and when we talk about data sharing, it's very important that that the consumers, all of us, as we consume this kind of information, that we can trust the rules of the game. And so therefore I really endorse it. I really also endorse it in particular because we have a distinction between risk categories. Yeah, obviously AI in a train is very different than AI in any kind of app that you're using in terms of, let's say, smart banking or whatever that is. Yeah, so therefore we need that kind of regulation. It makes very much sense to have a risk-based approach on that regard. And what's also great about that law or that act, if you like, is that we create those regulatory sandboxes where we can truly innovate. On the other hand, though, more importantly, though, from a cultural perspective, we tend to wait. We tend to wait until things are settled. And as you can imagine, and I was speaking a lot about speed, right? So speed is, if that's of the essence, then regulation will always trail. It always will be behind. So always regulation will try to catch up. And so if you are waiting for the regulation to catch up, you're already too slow again. So I believe we have to have this ability to really innovate very quickly, and maybe even in areas where it's not as precise at the very beginning, and then being regulated faster, but don't wait. I've seen this firsthand myself when we were talking about AI, in particular in medicine. And when it comes down to, for example, imaging, where you can, of course, have a lot of machine data, in particular images, right, that you can also then automatically interpret and diagnose. It was very interesting to see that while in the United States, it was clearly seen as a major benefit, and particularly in areas where you don't have doctors in order to provide the level of care, or in China, where you don't have radiologists at all, and where you clearly have the conversation about, you know what, instead of having no technology at all, I rather take that technology in order to provide it to, let's say, the more rural population, because I just simply don't have otherwise a good means of providing level care. Now, in Europe, it's a different conversation. In Europe is, well, we are very, first of all, it was the question about liability and whether we would bring this kind of technology at all into Europe. So there was huge hesitation in order to do this. The second step then was a long discussion about data regulations and what that meant and biases and so on. But in the meanwhile, others surged ahead. And I've seen that myself firsthand, where significant of money was flowing into these kind of also startups in China and the United States. And in Europe, we were still arguing about regulations. So of course, we need to have both. I would say we need that kind of regulation approach, but we need to have that mentality of startup mentality more in the European space.
All right, thank you. And then, so for the company side again, if, for example, a company is fearing legal prosecution or is just uncertain about which data can they use in their applications, you think the regulation that is coming is addressing these fears correctly, or should it address them differently?
No, I think for the most part they do. I think for the most part they do, and as I said, we are in Europe. I think it's very well structured and governed in a way. Governed in a way. What's different, what I mentioned earlier, is with regards to machine data. Yeah, because machine data, obviously, you could argue, well, why is that an issue to share that data? I think there actually what's interesting about it is what this will do to all kinds of other regulations. So it's not just the personal related information, but for example, to antitrust. Because as I said, digitalization breaks down silos. So in some instances, you will see that data is all of a sudden being visible to not us, but also to all of our competitors. So for example, what does this mean now if we work with, let's say, with a customer and we see all the assets from a competitor? Is that allowed or is that not allowed? How do you go about these? So there's a lot of questions still that are unclear about of how to go about it. And this is a kind of question that we have to answer. And this is a very good example, by the way, where I think if you try to regulate it on a clean sheet of paper, it would have never been there. Therefore, the reason is if you now come back later and really make it very applied and say, okay, what's the problem out there? We are running into this kind of problem, and then regulation follows. That's the better approach.
All right, thank you. Yeah, I quite like that approach of seeing the positive in taking some time to regulate, which is not something you hear a lot these days. And then also you mentioned a data strategy that is required for AI to be used efficiently. And of course, we've all heard it, data is the new oil. We've heard it many times. So how do you organize your data collection and data management? And you also briefly touched upon this in your last answer. How important is sharing the data with customers and where are the boundaries?
Yeah. Very good question. And I think first and foremost, I mean, there's pretty much two answers to this. One, who owns the data? And to me, it's always the customer owns the data. If you have, let's say, a pump, a train, a PLC, this is your data first and foremost, right? Because you have paid for it, you're generating this kind of data. And we are happy that actually we can continue, but we can, let's say, participate. So it's important who's the legal owner of that data, as opposed to, let's say, what is called secondary use rights. Now, where do we have those secondary use rights so that we have access to the data? And this comes now to my second part: is nobody wants to share data for the sake of sharing data. And I don't believe also that there is this notion of there's this very big central data lake where all the data comes in and it's a treasure trove and it's just the more the merrier. That's not what I'm talking about. What I'm talking about is the value that you actually can generate. Let's go back to the idea of Grundfos with regards to the pumps. We don't need to have every single sensor in order to have this in our database. That's not the case. It actually stays with the customer. What we need, of course, to have is access to it. We need to understand the edge cases, so those extreme cases that are relevant, so that we can learn from it. And now it comes to create that value for the customer. Customers do share data, but they only do share the data if they see the benefit. And that makes perfect sense to me.
All right, thank you. So this morning we had a session with Professor Helmut Schönenberger and Jean-Michel Dalle, and two central figures in the Munich and Paris ecosystems for startups. And since you also mentioned that speed is of the essence, they also called for more pan-European cooperation, so this is something that aligns with your view, I think. And therefore, I'd like to move away from these technical and regulatory questions now, and then focus on the strategy that you are doing or like going forward with Siemens. So there's a quote that I'd like to share with you, and then afterwards ask for your agreement with the statement. The quote is, EU regulations can even shape products which are sold outside the European Union, since companies might only want to make one product for the global market.
Yeah, now probably I need to be more diplomatic in my answer, but let me tell you, this is an interesting quote. I not necessarily agree with it though, and here's the catch to it. As I mentioned earlier, if you look at where the growth, the incremental growth is coming from, it's not, unfortunately, not coming from Europe. It's coming from China first and foremost, and second of all, it's coming from the United States. China just lately has really started to create a lot of standards. In the past, they used 60 or more than 60% of their standards were referencing back to international norms and standards, which was great for us. So then we were living in that world, as I mentioned 10 years ago, this hyper globalization. And truly, it was very convenient for us as a globally acting company in order to provide one part of, let's say, one version of a specific part. Now, as these standards become very, very local in a way, so right now, in many instances, in particular in the energy electronic space, we see right now three parts emerging: the European bloc, if you like, the American and the Chinese. And then if you are faced with the question of where and which standard do you really develop first and who takes the priority, of course, you look at where's the biggest growth potential. Unfortunately, that's not in Europe. It's rather in China or it's in the United States. So today, the bigger question is really not so much that this is creating an opportunity, it creates a necessity and a necessity that we were not waiting for, because as a consequence of that, in some instances, we have to create specific product lines for these three different standards or three different blocks in order to participate in that growth. Still, Europe is important in terms of its size, but it's not as important in terms of its dynamic, because there clearly other countries are much, much faster growing. So the idea that we have the standard that we create in Europe would only work if we had the power worldwide in order to enforce it also on other countries. And I don't think that this is happening today. At least not in the, I should qualify that, at least not in, we don't see that in the spaces where we are operating in.
All right, thank you for your answer to this. Europe is driving new standards of green economy, for example, and you also touched upon this. And Siemens is also pioneering with new corporate structures. I think many of us have been following the restructuring of Siemens and the split into Siemens, into 3 Siemens corporations. So what is the main driver behind these decisions?
Yeah, as I mentioned, Felix, at the beginning, it's speed and focus. It's the question of who knows the customer best and what do they need. Healthcare is so unique that this was a very, very obvious choice, if you like. The energy transition is something major. We would not have had the let's say the focus and the capacity in order also to invest and also not prioritize those investments into those areas. So these were the reasons behind it. Where we see this transitioning happening, and where we realize this, it would be best if these companies had also access to capital on their own way, and that's so far has worked out quite well.
All right, thank you. So before I come now to the questions of the audience, a quick personal question in between: how does one become a CTO of a tech giant like Siemens? Was it like always your aspiration, or did it just happen to be from your previous career?
Well, I don't think you can plan for it necessarily, and we tend to think always as a, let's say, let's call it as such, as a career, as a very linear, deliberate effort, so that you can make it to that, and then only after the fact then explain the exact reason why this happened. And now I could give you the very polished way of how one led to the other, and so it was the perfect plan. It never was. I started out at the very beginning not knowing what I wanted to do. Then at some point I knew that I wanted to build airplanes, which is the reason why I went to Airbus. Then I realized how important culture is, which is the reason why I went over to BCG. And then I get attracted by this word strategy, which I never knew what it was. And after 15 years of having been in strategy positions and roles and what have you, I'm even more confused ever than before. I always was fascinated by the power of technology, but I also was fascinated of really making these things real. And so, you know, sometimes it's just a matter of serendipity a little bit, but also of doing what you like most and what you're good at, I believe. And if you truly follow that, if you follow your convictions, your ideas, you're passionate about it, then actually great things happen. And I would have never dreamed to become the CTO of Siemens, to be honest. It was a big honor and pleasure ever since last year. And it's a huge obligation, as you can imagine also. But let me tell you, it's a lot of fun, because the power that it gives you, and power in a way to shape the world, to truly bring innovative solutions to the most pressing problems, which I spoke about with regards to decarbonization. Also, the whole idea about digitalization is actually one of the best things that are there out in the world.
That sounds indeed like a lot of fun. Thank you. So now I have some questions here that are coming from the audience. And I will just start with a question from Leah. And she asked, does Siemens conduct foresight activities? And or how do you prepare for possible extreme scenarios?
Yeah, thanks, Leah, for asking the question. And yes, we do. Absolutely. We do this from different perspectives. We do this from a strategic perspective, where we look at markets quite extensively. We look at studies of what's happening. For example, one right now that we're conducting is this whole scenario about decoupling, and really thinking about where this may go. And we have different scenarios, options. We talk to think tanks. We talk, of course, to a lot of consultancies. We also, of course, in working groups with the WEF and so on. So in that sense, and universities, of course. So from that perspective, we take topics and we look at them. And then also on the technology side, we do a lot of views on, of course, what's emerging technologies, what are technologies that we truly have to embark on and that are relevant for us. But quite frankly, the bigger topic is always what you're not embarking on. So let me give you an example. This quantum computing is a topic that we actually were wrestling with quite a bit, because I believe, I mean, if you want to take all the buzzwords right now that are out there, battery, energy storage, AI, and then of course quantum, it's very easy to say we do all of them. And so here we are. We purposefully decided not to go after quantum computing, at least not of the idea of building quantum computers themselves. What we're interested in, though, are their applications and their implications, in particular when it comes down to cyber, because you have to design already your systems, in particular if they're out there for 20, 30 years already ahead, which is quite an interesting thing. But the gist of it is really to abstain from the media hype and the general mainstream and saying, well, because everybody's now talking about it, it's not necessarily a good reason why you should be doing it as well.
All right, thank you. I hope that answered your question, Leah. And now the second question is from Kovac, and it is, which institution do you see in charge of working out regulations for the digital transformation? So if I may add a bit, maybe it's if it's just political sides and maybe also NGOs, maybe that's something, some direction which where this question goes into.
Yeah, great question too. And quite frankly, it's unclear, which is, I guess, one of the major reasons why we are where we are. Of course, the political side has a lot to do with it in that sense. And I mean, we touched on this question quite a bit. What's important to me is that we have, it's not single-sided. Yeah? So the whole idea about the use, the value, because it's very easy on the regulatory side to err on the risk side, right? So that you always wanted to be super risk averse, and that's fine. But if you do that, then you're creating a lot of opportunity gaps, which then, as I mentioned, that's why I like this example with regard to China, the radiologists, so much, because it's a huge opportunity for them, and it would have been a gap if it had been highly regulated. That's as far as I can say that. So it truly requires the stakeholders, in particular those of users, being tightly integrated in that kind of process as we do these regulations.
All right, thank you. So the next question is from Thorsten, and it is, why should ambitious students decide to work for Siemens? A bit of an HR question, I guess.
Why should they? Because I mean, for many reasons. And now, obviously, this is super biased, and don't you worry. This is this, you don't get all the marketing sprech, yeah, so all the marketing talk right now, because actually it's fun, and it's fun, and actually you can you can truly, as I said, you can truly change the way we do things in the world. I believe all the topics that we're working on are truly relevant for the next decade to come. And I can tell you that there's nothing more gratifying than thinking about how to make the energy transition, for example, work, and how to make those microgrids really work, how to bring this electrical e-car infrastructure, how do we make this work? How do we bring truly this Internet of Things, how to make that a reality? Because if you think about it, we have a huge issue with regards to demographic change. Yeah. So how can we actually really help also people to stay in the workforce, let's say until 65, 70? That means we have to help them in order to bring technology to the shop floor so that there's less strain on the physical exercise and everything that comes with it, and so on and so on. So truly, you're working on very relevant topics to society. And thereby doing this in a very international environment. I mean, Siemens is home in more than 190 countries. We have research activities all over the world, and we take a huge pride in it. That we have very significant footprints in China and the United States, and this really opens up the perspective of it. So if you are truly open to what is happening in the world, if you love technology and if you love to make this a reality, then I'd say then that's the right place to go.
Great, thank you. So next question is about IoT, and it's from Elizabeth, and she asks, talking about IoT, in which way do you think data transfer between devices should be enabled or rewarded in the future? And for example, IOTA.
Yeah, well, also a good question. Data transfer, I mean, there's all kinds of different ways of how to do that. It comes down to the question of where will the data reside in the future, right? So the whole discussion about centralized data with regards to data centers, meaning the cloud, is that the way to go? And quite frankly, I have my doubts. Of course, the cloud is always important in order to have data dissemination across a large population. That makes sense. But for the most part, it does not make sense. And in particular, if you take high frequency data, let's say from machine tools or any kind of robots, there's a lot of data that's never been needed yet again. And so that data you need to have, so edge computing, so truly localize and bringing that data, that capacity in terms of high performance, high storage locally. You have to think about how to transmit the data. I believe that 5G is, or 6G, but 5G as we speak, is the way to go with private bandwidth and networks, where you have this ultra high reliability networks and very low latency. That will be the future for sure. And I've seen this now many times. It's very interesting, by the way. So thank you, Elizabeth, for asking the question. When we talk about bringing this to life, very often I've seen factories struggling with the very simple question of connectivity and RJ45 network cable plugins, because they would argue they're being charged a lot in order just to make that work. And it's a key impediment. And what I see, though, in particular also for the devices that we are now creating at Siemens, they all will be, they're trending towards the 5G enabled and built in, so that connectivity becomes right out of the box, not a non-issue, and you can connect from the get-go.
Right, thank you. The next question is from Klaus, and he stated, you mentioned empowered people at Siemens. I heard about your internal crowdfunding Quickstarter. Do you think such a system would work for the EU audience?
For the EU audience, you say?
Organs, sorry.
Organs.
So, yeah.
Why not? I haven't thought about it, but I'd say absolutely, why not? I mean, the idea about actually crowdsourcing, I mean, that's the idea after all behind it, is definitely something that that I see very, very high value as one mechanism. You always have to be careful, because I was talking about the herd mentality, and so then you have a lot of biases. So if you want to go mainstream and don't want to err on the wrong side, that's the way to go. But I'd see this as one of the many tools in order to accomplish that. Because if we think truly in terms of the future and the major changes we have ahead of us, that crowdsourcing is probably not a good idea. So there you need to think in terms of the Horizon 2020s, really the longer term of what you want to do in order to accomplish that. So there's different tools for that.
Right, thank you. The next question is from Andong, and it states, how important are industrial customers in China, e.g. in industrial AI, Industry 4.0 to Siemens?
Huge, and thanks for asking the question. As I mentioned this earlier, it's well, I mean, obviously China is right now really driving the growth on this planet as we speak. What we really enjoy is that is the openness, in fact, so and the speed that is happening in China. And what we realize is, and also talking about empowerment. It doesn't work. It doesn't work if you try to mandate this from Germany or from the United States or from elsewhere. You truly need to be local for local. You need to have your own, and we have that ourselves. We have our research teams working hand in hand with our consultants, for example, that go out and jointly develop solutions for all kinds of different customers, industrial customers, but also finance customers, insurance customers that all are in need for IoT solutions in particular, and bringing them to life. And as a matter of fact, it's a great, I don't want to say test bed, but it's a great innovation ecosystem, a very local one though, because as you know, data must not flow outside the countries. It's very different companies that operate in China. So it's its own bubble, if you like. But it's your own bubble that shows you what is feasible and what's possible. And I wished for us as Europeans, of many of us, that you could see the same thing that I often have the privilege of seeing, just the speed of the way the innovation is happening there. I sometimes wish we just had that same mindset of can do and really move at lightning speed.
All right, thank you. So I'll take one more question from the audience. And this one is from Søren, and he asked, should European governments or the European Union create a common industrial strategy to preserve technological leadership, even at the cost of protectionism? I think it's a big one for the end.
Yeah, it is a big one. Yes and no. If we do that, unfortunately, I have to say this again, it comes back to speed. For the most part, until we find, I've seen this, right? This kind of very delicate balancing act between our nations in Europe, right? In particular between France and Germany, because we tend to be, of course, the largest economies in this on this continent. It's a lot of deliberation, and that deliberation takes a lot of time. And so I don't think that is the answer, quite frankly. Maybe as an example, though, as what I think is definitely something where we need to act in unison and together is when it comes down to data sovereignty. For sure, we have to find a way that the information and the data that we create in Europe stays in Europe. Why is that possible in China? And why do we have the Americans also the ability to reach into all kinds of continents? And why haven't we cracked that code yet? And I think, and of course, obviously, I'm talking about Gaia X. The idea about Gaia X and the idea about data sovereignty is absolutely quintessential for everything that we're doing. And so there, I absolutely believe in it. I don't believe in it, though, to say now we're creating our own hyperscaler, because that will not work that way, because it's always going to be substituted, subsidized, and it will never work at the speed of what is commercially necessary. But regulating of what kind of data will be stored where and who has access to this is absolutely critical.
All right, thank you. I think that's a great way to end this Q&A section. And so also thank you to everybody who was sending in their questions. And with that, we've almost come to the end of this session. So as a takeaway from today's session, what is your advice to young talents out there who really want to make a difference and have an impact? Is there anything you would have loved to have heard back when you were sitting in your lecture halls?
Yeah, look, indeed. I mean, it only feels 20 years back. I'd say be curious and also courageous. There's a lot of uncertainty coming our way, and failure, in particular in Germany, is always considered as something where you would say, "Wow, this is actually kind of bad." But you also can look at failure as a learning opportunity. And trust me, I'm doing so many mistakes every day, and it's a very rich learning ground of becoming better. What I realized is, though, when I studied, there were two things. Number one, we were focusing on the what. Yeah, what is the technology at hand? And actually, what's really important is the how. The way you lead, the way you cooperate, the way you work with people is something I really encourage you to get as much experience as you can outside those university halls, lecture halls. And the second one of all is, although, I mean, if I think about it, of all the semesters I had on math and everything, most of it, quite frankly, I'm not using anymore, which is a shame, but that's reality. And so what's even more important now is actually to not just think about the technology that is there, but truly its difference that it makes. And not just thinking technology forward and being excited, but really thinking about customer backwards. And that is, what actually can this technology solve? So go out there, be curious, learn, look at Europe maybe from an outside perspective, see what the big problems are, and then enjoy in realizing your dream and your vision.
Great, thank you so much, Peter. I'm sure our fellow students really took some great pieces from this. So we hope that you all enjoyed the session and you drew many inspirations from it. And since we want to keep improving our events and also keep bringing the world's leaders and shapers to you, we created a short survey, which you can now find in the chat. So on the right or below the video. And many, many thanks to you, Peter, of course, for taking your time, sharing your insights with us. And I'm sure you were able to spark some interest in technology in our viewers. So please make sure to follow us on social media to keep updated. Bye-bye, Peter.
Thank you. My pleasure.
Run now. Yes. Thank you. Bye. So please make sure to follow us on social media to stay updated about our next events during this European Union week and the remainder of the year. And then also you can find a networking room on the left side of the screen. In half an hour, European Union week continues with the winners of the U2P Europe Prize 2021, who will talk about responsible ecological digitalization. So to everybody, stay healthy and see you at our next events. Goodbye.